If you're looking for some easy abstract sketchbook ideas, you have come to the right place. These are all ink-based exercises. I'll be using micron pens, as well as a pencil and my kneaded eraser. You can do all of these exercises in black and white, but I'll be adding color with a watercolor brush pen and some Tombow markers. And I'll also be adding a little watercolor to one of my exercises. I'm working in a square watercolor sketchbook today, and I'll go ahead and list all the materials I use down below. I think this first idea was the quickest to do, and it also might have been the most fun. I'm using different colored jelly roll pens. I've got a teal, a purple, and a blue. And I'm clipping down my pages because they're very thick, and it was really hard to get them to stay flat. So the idea behind this is pretty basic. We're just making squares. What makes it look so interesting in the end is how they are laid out. So I'm using a continuous line to make squares of different shapes and colors and connecting them all together. You'll notice that my squares are absolutely not perfect, especially because I'm using a textured watercolor paper. So it's a bit bumpy and my lines get a bit wobbly here and there, but that doesn't affect how neat the page looks in the end. If you decide to use jelly roll pens, be careful because they can stay wet a bit longer than other ink pens. So I did a lot of flipping around and rotating of my sketchbook so that I didn't sit my hand in the wet ink. I did this project once before, and of course I smudged half of it, but it's all in good fun. To get the same effect as I do, it's important that you overlap your squares in certain areas. It can be with the same color or with a different color. Just make sure you have different sizes of squares and some of them go over each other. You can see here I'm testing to make sure that the ink is dry. Once you get a lot of squares on your page, it can be hard to tell where you last made a square and which ones are still wet. This was my favorite part of the exercise, coloring in the squares. I chose purple and green and blue colors to complement the colors that I had used for the outlines. These are Zig Clean Color Real Brush Pens, and like I said, I will link them down below. They work a bit like watercolor, so you can manipulate them with water, but they also don't hold a lot of water. So you don't need a watercolor sketchbook to use them. I would just suggest testing them out on your paper to make sure it doesn't bleed through too much. Fill in as many of the squares you like. You could even fill in the background if you want. And if you're not interested in using color, you could consider making the background black and using a white jelly roll pen to make the squares. I know not everybody will feel the same way I do, but I just love using the super fine, sharp tip of these markers to fill in all sides of the squares. I'm really curious, how do you feel about it? Let me know in the comments below. Here is the end result. It reminds me of stained glass or Piet Mondrian paintings, and it kind of also reminds me of a circuit board. I'm calling this next exercise circle bursts, but I'm not exactly making circles. There's really no need to sketch this out if you don't want to. However, I wanted to lay out where my circles were going to go before I started using my ink pen. As you can see, they almost look like rocks, and I'll be adding rings inside of each of them. The rings don't need to be centered at all. In fact, I think they look a little bit better in the end if they're off to one side and the centers are in different spots in each circle or rock. I'm using a Micron 03 fine liner here, and I won't be following the sketch exactly, but I'm using them as guides to create circles inside of circles. When you're done outlining, it's time to add lines inside of each ring, sort of like the spokes of a bicycle. I point the lines toward the center of each circle, and they can be as far apart or as close as you want. They can be equidistant to each other, or you can randomly make them skinnier or fatter, depending on what you like the look of. If you're hesitant to try this out because it looks like a lot of work, it does take time, but it is fabulous for hand control and getting straight lines without a ruler, and the end result is pretty awesome, if you ask me. This might actually be my favorite sketchbook idea of all time. I'm not sure. I'm pretty sure I learned a variation of this from Lisa Congdon. She's one of my huge influences. If you haven't heard of her, I'll link her down below. But I have made this in different sizes and colors and with different materials. It is so much fun. It can be tricky here working with a half circle, so I always remember to point my lines inward towards the center, even if it's an invisible center, and it tends to make my lines look better. I decided to use my watercolor brush pens again for this exercise. However, this time I'm also going to add some water to spread out the color. So I'm grabbing a paintbrush and my water jug, and I start with adding color to the edge of the circle, and as I'm going along, I'm adding a bit of water to thin out and spread the color a little bit. And I think it has this really neat gradient effect. It looks really pretty in the end. If you're feeling adventurous or just can't get enough of this page, you could color in each spoke individually, or maybe even go crazy and make a rainbow. The possibilities are really endless. Because my circles were lightly colored, I decided to use a dark color for the background to really make them pop off the page. And here is the completed result. They almost look like shells to me. If you decide to try this idea, I'd love to know what materials you use and what colors you use, and let me know what you thought of drawing all the tiny little lines. Since this is my favorite exercise, I had to take it a step further onto the next page, and I turned my circles into waves. I added text in between some of the waves, and then I incorporated the same colors, so the two pages worked well together. I added a washi tape frame to my next sketchbook page, and I'm using my micron pen to add a border right inside the washi tape. We're making lines again, but this time they will be in the shapes of triangles. I started by freehanding my triangles, but eventually I switched to a ruler. With a ruler, the lines come out straighter and the process goes a bit quicker. Whatever way you prefer is fine. The idea here is to make triangles of different sizes. The triangles don't all have to meet at a point, but the idea is for each shape to have 3 sides. Now, if you look closely, when I'm finished making all my triangles, there is one shape that is not a triangle, and I do fix that at the end. Let me know if you can find it in the comments below. You can keep your washi tape on while you fill in the triangles, or you can take it off like I do here. Now it's time to fill those triangles. For this first one, I've decided to use washi tape again as a border around the triangle, to keep any marks I make from bleeding into the triangle next to it. I'm using my Posca pen for this first triangle, and all I'm doing are making dots. You'll see dots are the theme of this sketchbook idea. I'll be making lots of dots in lots of the triangles on this page. If you're not a dot fan, feel free to fill the triangles with whatever you like. I needed to give the Posca pen time to dry in the triangle below, so I left the washi tape on until it did so completely. I've moved on to my Micron Graphic 1 pen, and I'm making much smaller organic dots in the triangle above. When the Posca pen was dry, I removed the washi tape, and because one of the lines of the triangle wasn't exactly straight, I didn't get the dots all the way to the edge, so I just filled it in very carefully with my Micron 1. I have a little obsession with organically spaced dots, so some are touching, they're not evenly spaced. It's just a preference I have. You can make your dots any way you like. I wanted some of my triangles to have a darker background, so I'm using a Micron brush pen to fill it in with black. Eventually I'll go over this with tiny white dots. For my last dot-related triangles, I am drawing open dots with my Micron pen, and I'll use a thicker fine liner to fill in the background. By the time I was done with all these dot-filled triangles, I realized I wanted some solid color triangles to break up the space and let the eyes rest. So here I'm using watercolors to painting some of the empty triangles. If you're interested, this is Moon Glow by Daniel Smith, and my next color is a mixture of Potter's Pink by Daniel Smith and a purple by Sennelier. I also added some more solid black triangles because I really liked the way they look before I added the white dots. And our triangle page is complete. I love the watercolor triangles juxtaposed by all the dotted triangles. It's very graphic and interesting to look at, and I can't wait to try one with some other colors. For our final project, I'm just using black and white. However, if you stick around to the end, I have another version of the same exercise with lots of different colors. I went ahead and framed off this page as well, but I did not outline the frame. And we're starting with some simple waves down the center of the page. I'm calling this one Tangled because by the end it's going to be full of wavy lines that weave in and out of each other. This is another sketchbook idea that will help you work on your hand control. So for most of these lines, it's one continuous line, and I'm using my arm to drag my hand down the page. I've been doing this for such a long time that I'm really used to making lines in whatever shape I want, but I know it's not easy for everyone, especially if you're a beginner. So don't get too concerned if your lines are a little awkward at first. And anyway, these first lines will be traced over in a thicker marker, so don't worry too much about the outcome. I'm starting with a limited 5 or 6 pairs of lines on purpose, because once we get going, there are going to be so many lines, it'll be hard to know which ones are paired up. When I'm done with the first handful of lines, I'm going to choose another marker to thicken them up. This exercise might be a bit easier if it's not on a textured watercolor paper. I hit some bumps and I go off track a few times, but they still look good in the end. Next, I'm adding more lines in between the pairs of lines. To me, they sort of resemble hair, or maybe even muscle tendons. For the next set of lines, we'll be weaving them in and out of the lines we just created. I think this was the most relaxing of all these sketchbook ideas. It was probably because it was repetitive and soothing, and the fact that I really like drawing wavy lines. If you don't feel like filling lines within lines, as always, make this exercise your own. You could fill them up with more dots or scallops or even just solid colors. This last part is really fun. I fill in all the crevices with black using a thicker fine liner pen. And for all you tape removal fans, here is the final result. I really like the way this turns out without a black border. As you can see, you don't have to have perfect lines for a really striking result. And in case color is more your speed, here is another version that I did a few days later with my Tombow markers. I went from lighter shades to darker shades of pink and purple and some midnight blue. Thanks for joining me. If you had a favorite exercise, please let me know, and I'll see you soon. Take care.